Hey y'all, welcome to season 5, episode 7 of The Green Agenda. You got a new face tonight. My name is LaTricea Adams, founder and president of Young Gifted and Green. Shout out to our girl Kayla for holding it down all season long, but really happy to be here for this episode, which is super important. So excited to introduce our fangirling, our guest for this evening. Tonight's episode is Heat Waves and Health Navigating Rising Temperatures. This is right on time because we are literally burning up as we are in the early parts of summer. So tonight we'll discuss the intersection between public health and extreme heat events. And we have none other than Leslie Fields Esquire, put some respect on her name, who is the Chief Federal Officer at We Act for Environmental Justice. So let's get into it. So Leslie, before we get into the nitty-gritty of tonight's conversation, I just wanted to give you your flowers. So just, this is kind of off script, but I remember the first time that I met you was actually at Howard. So I was bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, trying to figure out, like, what is EJ? We should know about this. And there was an event at Howard, and I was just so captivated because I didn't see a lot of Black people, especially like Black women in this space, particularly that has the air of expertise around, like, law. You're a whole attorney in environment. So I was so just mesmerized at that point in time. And I think it's really important for other Black girls like me to see women like you, to understand what those possibilities are. Because when we think about movement work, we need attorneys. We need people that have expertise like in the law. We can, fight until we're blue in the face, but a lot of that fight does require attorneys. So just wanted to start by grounding us and giving you your flowers there. But, even though millennials, we used to be the youngest, we got Gen Z now. I can't believe it. Now we got Gen Alpha. Gen Alpha is in high school. What's happening?
It happens.
It happens, right? Yeah. So thinking about some of our younger viewers, could you talk to us a little bit about how you got into this work?
Okay. Thank you so much. I am so honored to be with you, and I fangirl you too all the time. You are just a fantastic light and beacon for justice and environmental justice, and I'm very proud and always want people to understand that the way you're based in place and you're based at home and you're based in Memphis is so important, and that you can do this work anywhere you are. And that's why I love EJ, because anybody can do it. You can be a child, you can be a grandmama, abuela, you can be an artist, educator, attorneys. We need everybody in this space. And so I just want to congratulate you on all your success. And I also want to know that we support you. You've got some serious fights in Memphis, we know. And Memphis is a very important place in this country, the history of Memphis. And you are part of that Ida B. Wells legacy, okay? Yeah. Great Black women coming out of Memphis. So, but you have to also take care of yourself, okay? And I want to encourage everyone also as well. So EJ found me. I was a young lawyer. I'd started out, I enjoyed the nature and the outdoors, fishing with my grandparents and being outside. I had a big garden, and then I got to be in the woods, and I'm just like a little hippie girl at heart. And so I always like to hike, and an avid biker, and we have a great set of trails in this part of the country and the DMV. So I've enjoyed being outside and appreciated nature very much. And but after, when I was in law school, I got involved in farm worker advocacy. I worked for a farm worker advocacy organization, but I was also interested in civil rights and voting rights. And I realized that it's the same communities, all right? And so there's so much intersectionality, but there's also so much commonality when you don't have your democracy and then you don't have a good environment that everyone deserves to have. So I was at the time living in Texas. I was the Texas Legislative Council, and I was volunteering for the Texas NAACP, and I was also volunteering for the Texas Sierra Club and learning about just putting these things together. There's all these issues in Texas, and at the same time, all these civil rights issues. And there's a great Texas State Conference president, and he's still on the national board, Gary Bledsoe, one of my best friends, who would send us out on the weekends because we were the young guard back then, and noticed that all these things were happening. For example, these children were being born with birth defects who were from farm worker women's children, the women in the maquiladores, and women who were exposed to chemicals in refineries and all these sorts of things. There wasn't any, the county hospitals had these clusters, but the rest of the state wasn't doing anything because they didn't have the data. And at the same time, I was working on redistricting. And so putting those things together on the data, and the GIS back then were in these big mainframes. You had to spend all night running maps and running the data. Now you got it on your computer. You all know how much easier it is. So just running around basically Region 6 with the NAACP on the weekends and putting these issues together. And I went to I was in Austin. I learned at the knee of the great Suzanne Almanza and Poder. There was a great big issue there around there was a tank farm that they got moved out of their community in East Austin, the Holly Power Plant. And then in 1992, I heard about this conference at Xavier University, and that was Dr. Beverly Wright's first conference. And I went there, and I met Dr. Wright, Dr. Bullard, Charles Lee. I met the late great Luke Cole, who was an attorney for the California Rural Services Program, who started another organization, and he talked about a case he was working on in California called Kettleman City, and I sat back and was like, this is what I want to do. This is the environment, this is the civil rights part. And so that's what I started, and I just started volunteering, and then I went to the chapter director of the Sierra Club in Austin, and I wrote what I thought was a grant or business proposal, and he looked at, we laugh about it now, and I said, there's all this work happening in Texas and elsewhere, all these problems with the refineries, all these problems with the farm workers, all these problems with there was a lead smelter in West Dallas that was raining, that they put a middle school next to. I remember and then I went out to Odessa. I started out doing school sightings cases. And in Odessa, there was a Dynagen, a synthetic rubber plant next to a small school off of I-10 with black and brown kids. And I went out there and I taped a map on the dashboard, and I did a magic marker. That was my GPS. And I just started driving, and I got to the community meeting, and I'm like, what holy hell is this? Who puts a school next to a synthetic rubber plant?
Right.
And all the abuelas and the grandmas are looking at me. I just said, I'll have to get back to it. I didn't know what to do. I went back to Austin, went to the law library, looked up Texas Health and Safety Code. There's nothing in there. Started looking through the Clean Air Act, which is a monster statute, right? And I had the epiphany, there isn't anything.
Wow.
Okay, we have to make this up. So we've been making it up as we go along, but going to that 92 conference, Dr. Wright, is where I realized, that's where I met some of the great leaders, and then Charles Lee told me, you need to meet Vernice Miller.
Yeah.
And she was at NRDC at the time, and I went to New York, and I cold called her. She invited me over to brunch that day, and it really helped me. So it was one thing after another, making up jobs, making up opportunities. And then I came back to worked for the a lot of different projects, and did some redistricting work. Came back to DC, and I was the international director for Friends of the Earth, so got involved with international issues, make those connections, particularly in Nigeria. Did a lot of work on gas flaring. It's the same companies bedeviling the same people. It's Royal Dutch Shell, BP, and the only difference between the Niger Delta and Louisiana Delta, there's no difference. It's just still black people. So all that sort of thing. Long story short, it's been a blessing. But at the same time, it is really a place where anybody can be involved, and you can get involved in your child's school. You can get involved in building out art. You can get involved writing, And I encourage people to really look at your local environment, look at what's happening or not happening, and get involved in your level, right? Get involved as much as you can. It's been really, and to be able to see people like you and others come into it, particularly young women, young black women, I think there's opportunities. You have to learn to do a lot of things, nonprofit management, fundraising. We are in a milieu now of, being the administration not being against us, but that's happened before. And I think we are doing enough great work right now in building community that when the tables turn, and the tables will turn, we will prevail. All right? And I see you and many others, the younger people, like I feel like I'm the mountaintop generation. You're going to take us to the promised land.
That's right.
Okay.
We have our marching order.
Yes.
So I'm so glad we started out with that. I mean, the legend, you're being modest, but I almost got chills just listening to, first of all, the 90s was a time.
Yeah.
It's just so essential to this work to hear some of the greats. Shout out to the one and only Dr. Beverly Wright, who is just such a breath of fresh air, a mentor. We got some of that Southern spirit in us. So
she's still on it.
Yeah, she keeps me grounded.
Right, me too.
But so grateful for you just kind of giving us a historical timeline. But just kind of to sum up, one of the things that really resonated with me, what you shared, is EJ work is everywhere. And, I think about when I first got started was during the wake of the Flint water crisis. It's like, no, I'm not from Flint, but it doesn't matter.
Right.
It doesn't matter. Right. So I think about, like what MLK taught us. Right. So and justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So whether you're at home, whether you, moved away, like I moved away for a little bit from Memphis, but came back home, like the work can still go with you. So thank you for sharing that. So let's get right into it. Heat waves. Ooh, now I know I'm from Memphis, but even in Memphis, it's getting way too hot. Okay. So heat waves disproportionately impact marginalized communities due to factors like urban heat island effect, also inadequate housing. So it's like weatherization issues or lack of access to that. There's a litany of different issues that are really connected to extreme heat. So can you kind of elaborate on some of the historical and systemic factors such as redlining, discriminatory zoning policies that exacerbate some of these disparities that we see, particularly in Black and Brown communities?
Thank you for that good question. First, I want to say, I am the Chief Federal Officer for We Act for Environmental Justice. We're based in Harlem. And Peggy Shepard is our Executive Director, and she's also still on it. Okay?
We love you, Miss Peggy.
And so We Act in D.C. is the federal office for the Harlem office. So I'm going to be talking a lot about what's going on in northern Manhattan and Harlem. All right? And but I also want, speaking of historic perspective, we are right at the anniversary of the 30 years ago, there was a horrendous heat wave in Chicago. My uncle, my mother's brother, suffered greatly in this heat wave. He had COPD. And Korean War vet, and it was really, it really was shock. About 700 people died. Okay, and so it was a terrible, terrible thing, and so we have been suffering from heat, and I think that that heat wave did focus folks a little bit on this issue, just like we're about to commemorate, believe it or not, 20 years after Katrina, and Rita. And then there've been so many hurricanes since. Okay, it's honestly, Katrina, Rita, Ida. There's so many. Not to mention Super Storm Sandy, and all these, and there'll be more. And so, because of the climate crisis, we have more severe heat. We have more severe storms. There's more water in the atmosphere because we are heating up because of the greenhouse gas effect, right? And so as you know, we're getting more water in the atmosphere. There's more rain. It is raining harder every day now, okay? And all the extreme weathers are much harder and harsher and long-lasting, and the hurricanes are much bigger now. And so, because of the climate crisis, and we are losing the ice from the polar ice caps, and the sea levels are rising. So basically, the understanding redlining in this historical context is super important to all of this, because communities that succumb to heat-related illnesses are mainly communities of color, and that redlining began in the 1930s as a way for the homeowners loan corporation to identify areas by their level of financial lending risk to bank loans, from bank loan officers and appraisers and city officials to segregate communities by redlining them and whether they were worthy of bank loans. And this became a tool to enforce racial discrimination and economic deprivation. And they graded neighborhoods with large populations of African Americans and also immigrants as the riskiest neighborhoods to provide loans to. There's been there's a great book called The Color of Law about this. Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote about this, okay? And when it's his reparations article. And so these communities have struggled for housing and economic development because they have been redlined. And these are many of our communities in every community. And also, you also have the issue of the highways being cut through our communities. That thanks to Robert Moses. And I would commend to anybody the book The Power Broker by Robert Caro. That is one of the most well-researched books I've ever read in my life. It's a 1,200-page doorstop, and he was the dean of city planning, and he was the one that cut these highways, cut this Cross-Bronx Expressway through New York, and other city planners. When you see where the highways go through these black neighborhoods and cutting them up, and then also you've got the mobile sources of the cars going in and out of the suburbs, which are segregated, coming into the city, so the black folks and the people of color had the pollution from the cars, okay, and then those motorists would drive off to their cleaner suburbs, all right? So you have a heat light in effect because of the segregation, densely packed communities, densely packed apartments, the only kinds of places that African Americans could live in coming up from the South in the Great Migration, right? And some of them couldn't buy their apartments, and so they had to rent at outrageous prices. And you had that heat density, you have fewer trees, you have fewer parks, all right? And there's been a lot of studies done on this. So all of that, even though the redlining was outlawed by the discrimination laws, it's left a big imprint. We still have the highways cutting through our neighborhoods, as you well know. And so in Harlem, residents would have the highest heat vulnerability index score. And this is developed by the New York Department of Health and Mental Hygiene to describe a community-led risk to harm and heat-related indicators such as the air temperature and also the lack of green space and the heat island effect of the sidewalks and the streets of everything else like that. And so these red line neighborhoods are much hotter than other neighborhoods, and there's more paved surfaces. The disinvestment in the infrastructure has led to also poorly constructed buildings, and they're much more poorly constructed, so it's much harder to weatherize them to get more energy efficient opportunities for them, and it creates heat-related illnesses, heat stroke, heat exhaustion. You also see folks at the bus stops, right, at the train stations, no cover, okay? There's no cover, there's no tree cover, they're out in the elements. And the vulnerable populations, the elderly, and children in particular. Children are smaller bodies. They are respiratory, their respiratory systems are more rapid, they're closer to the ground, they're playing. They are very, very vulnerable too. All right, and you have to really watch the children when it's very, very hot outside, because kids are kids and they're not regulating themselves. So when you see people have stopped sweating, when you see evidence of heat stroke, evidence of rapid breathing, skin discoloration, you really should pay attention for elderly populations, disabled folks, and then also kids. We also, higher temperatures increase energy consumption, okay? So people make the decision about, can I cut my air conditioner on or can I go buy some food, right? Yeah. Because the energy bills are higher and their buildings are less heat efficient, so you feel like you're air conditioning the outside sometimes, right? And so that's really terrible. And then it reduces the heat effect reduces outdoor activity. You know, you don't want to go for a walk, right? You don't want to exercise. You don't want to take advantage of being outside, even if you might have a park, because it's just too hot. And and there's no water fountains or anything like that, those kinds of amenities in your community. So all this has happened inside these red line communities. It's not just about drawing a line. It is about the incredible racial discrimination and disinvestment that's been going on. And there's a lot of good groups that are addressing this. There's targeted interventions now. People are planting trees. There's this great group called Communities for Sustainable CSC. And Portsmouth, Virginia, and they've got this Cool Down P-Town program, and so they got people out there planting trees, the Communities for Sustainable Development, and they're planting trees and they're making people aware of what's happening outside and how they can mitigate these effects. And there also has to be equitable development, right? You know, future projects for green space, okay? Create pocket parks. You know, and that's really fun too. You can get young people into that, and also revere the spaces that maybe there was some great historical opportunities. You know, our people have always felt close to nature. Right. Our people, we have relatives who were baptized in the water. Right, baptized in the river. There's a wonderful community in Turkey Creek, Mississippi, and they are trying to preserve that. You know, the creek there because people used to be baptized there. The churches were there. People, you know, and the Gullah Geechee communities, right, in Georgia, they are very attuned to the nature and the spirituality of water and the spirituality of the coastline there. And so it's very important that these practices continue, that we have the spirituality of being outside and being able to enjoy the outdoors, but it's really hard to do it when, you know, it's hot and you're surrounded by concrete and industrial facilities and trucks and all these things. If you're by a port, so yeah, all these things contribute to very poor air quality and very poor health outcomes.
Yeah, so that is really a domino effect, right? So it's all of these intersectional like disparities that just kind of come to a head. As I was listening, also another group that I think about often with this extreme heat are pregnant people.
Yes.
Ooh, you know, it's two people or more, depending on, you know, how much you got, how many babies you're gonna have. But that's also just you know, when we think about this, one from a historical perspective, but even from a current perspective, it's truly like genocide, right? Like it's an act of genocide. When we think about systemic racism, we think about legacy pollution that's also exacerbated by all the things that you name. It's not by happenstance. No. It's literally systemic, like it's on purpose. But I think that it's really important, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, when we think about the implications for policy, when we think about like concepts like cumulative impacts, for example, it is really important. And one other thing before we go into this next question that you made me think about is the actual infrastructure of both housing and commercial buildings as well. Thinking about like, it is really hot. And like, how does that apply to the engineering, the actual structure of buildings, of homes? And then I even think about when you brought up like with like issues surrounding like weatherization. So I think about, you know, being from the South, being from Memphis, the community where both of my parents grew up, and actually was the first community that my great grandparents moved to because they didn't have a choice because it still was Jim Crow. In addition to it being really hot, the proximity to a refinery and like how that exacerbates like air pollution in a zip code like where my parents and my family still lives is 17 industries that are consistently releasing pollution on top of that extreme weather.
And you all got the FedEx there.
Right, we do.
24-hour airport.
24 hours, you know, 7 days a week. And so all of those things are compounded. So I really like the fact that you brought up like all of these different pieces that kind of coalesce. Unfortunately, that causes all sorts of issues ranging from economic disparities, housing disparities, and also public health. So glad that you were able to help us to really connect those dots. So kind of, going in the same vein. So I think about my daddy before we get into this question. And even like other people like in my family that have a agrarian type of background, like spent time outside. Like some of my fondest memories of my daddy is us being outside and doing things outside. And unfortunately, with the type of heat waves that we have, it really steals part of children's childhood.
That's right.
Because it is so intensely hot. But even beyond that, our workforce that spends a huge amount of time outdoors. So many of our frontline essential workers, and I kind of cringe with that because it makes me think about COVID time, because I used to be an essential worker too as an educator. But from many frontline and essential workers, sometimes often come from low income communities or communities of color. They are the most at risk, often being exposed to extreme heat in their workplaces. So this not only impacts their health, but impacts like their livelihood. So thinking about that, what specific policies or workforce protections are needed to better safeguard workers from extreme heat and the illnesses that come from that? And how can we really focus on enforcement? Because it's one thing, get cute policies passed, but is it being implemented with fidelity?
Right. No, that's a very good, very, very good point. So the people who have to work outside really are at risk. Farm workers, construction workers, all the folks who work outside, the highway people, you see folks outside all the time. And it's really, 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 employers have the responsibility, should ensure workers have access to water, shaded area for breaks, and opportunities to rest and recover from heat exposure. Workers should be acclimatized. All right. So meaning that a few hours a day at first, right? Okay. Or you see this time of year more construction being done at night. Okay. So that's a little cooler. Or you make folks, you're up they come in early in the morning, super early in the morning, if it's going to be to keep track of basically keep track of the weather, keep track of if it's going to be a certain kind of degree day. And also to make sure that people are trained on illness prevention and educate workers on the symptoms of heat stroke and heat-related emergencies, and to follow different regulations. And there are proposed regulations. There's a proposed OSHA heat standard that could protect a lot of lives, and special work protocols so that the heat index gets above 80 to 90 degrees. Then that there's basic effective measures. The employers are communicating with the workers about, how hot it's getting. And you'll have to but that will require enforcement by the Department of Labor agents. And right now we're in a place where that is, all these positions are being cut, right? Yeah. And so there are, according to the Department of Labor, from 1980 to 2016, an average of 421 million U.S. work hours were lost annually due to heat. Low-income workers are the most impacted, and they're suffering heat-related injuries. And so it's really about prevention, okay? And it's really and we're also exposing, then you have higher healthcare costs, right? So Maryland has a heat standard. California has a heat prevention program. Okay, so you can imagine these states have it now. In Texas, Governor Abbott got rid of the water breaks for the workers. And I was in Corpus Christi last year, and I remember seeing these men working on that bridge in the port, right? And it is brutal out there, okay? So we have to be about making sure we advocate in our communities for these worker protections. And it really applies to also people working in warehouses. And we're seeing many more warehouses. The indoor air problem is just as hot if you're not ventilated, if not worse. You see the construction workers, if they're in a building, the building doesn't have the HVAC yet.
Ooh,
so
yeah. Ooh.
it's like probably working under like a magnet, right?
Ooh.
With the glass. So they should be, they should be getting rests and breaks, and they have to wear a lot of protective equipment, right?
Yeah.
They rotate firefighters in and out, right? For that reason, okay? Because they got all this equipment on in the heat, So all of these things, these are all things that employers have to be, they should be aware of, and that should be enforced for the workers. And there's there was a lot of litigation for the farm workers to make sure that they've got what they needed in terms of water and sanitation out in the fields, And I think about the women in particular, so you mentioned. And I just, you see, and we don't want to be like some parts of the world where people are literally having to work, children out there working, dying and being, you're basically being stunted because of being exposed to the elements, being exposed to the chemicals, being exposed indoor and outdoor if you're in a refinery or you're on a platform somewhere and you're in the direct sun and heat, and it's getting worse. So the worker issue is super important, and there's unions working on this, and we can definitely be in solidarity with them.
Yeah, I love that. I would be remiss if I didn't, acknowledge being from Memphis and thinking about, unfortunately, where MLK took his last breath.
Right.
That was a fight for both environment and labor rights.
That's right.
And I think, listening to what you shared, it's really important that there is consistent coalition building, like with unions, with understanding the intersections between workforce policies and the implications for climate change is really important. And that is, mind blowing to think about, like in Texas. Oh my God. Out of all places, right? Considering how hot it gets in Texas, to roll something back like that. But, there's promising things that we can learn from, in like the state of Maryland and in California. Even things, it's making me think about things that you can do at the local level. It might not necessarily require a state level statutory requirement. There are things that you can do as business owners. There's things that you can do, from like resolutions at the local level or ordinances. So I'm really glad that you lifted those examples up, because, politics is local, and we can't say that like, I don't like politics. Us having this conversation right now is still governed by something political, right? So that was very
politics
inspiring.
Is relational too.
It is. Okay? It is, and it's unavoidable.
You have a relationship with your local person, the person who's put themselves out there, right? And it's like, and if you don't have a relationship, then that's when things start to go off the rails. Right.
It goes left real quick.
And they need to hear from all of us on every level. And it doesn't have to be all the time, right? But, what's important if it's your kid's school, all right? Yeah. Or you want to put a community garden in, okay? All of these things help mitigate the effects, right? Of what we're talking about. And, make life worth living.
Yeah, that gets me, and this is a perfect segue. So now we're getting into some strategies. Now, one thing that I absolutely, among many, that I love about We Act is there is such a huge focus on community mobilization, but then also like education strategy that literally is so like engaged and just coming from community up, right? So thinking about that, how can community-led initiatives and that traditional knowledge, you touched on it in some of your responses, being from African descent, we have a natural connection to the land. So how can community-led initiatives, traditional knowledge, how could that be integrated in some of the heat resiliency strategies that we know that we need? Because it's not getting any cooler anytime soon. So just really interested to hear what strategies you may have in mind.
Well, I think, it's engaging the community. So that means culturally appropriate in the appropriate languages and dialects. Okay, we forget that people have different dialects. There are folks that come up from south of the border. They don't speak Spanish. They speak another dialect. They speak an Indian dialect, right? And so from different parts of Central and South America. And the Caribbean too, right? And so, everything should be in the appropriate language, right? And respecting the appropriate language, respecting the religious or spiritual practices, because it may it will require being in special sacred places. So respecting sacred places, and I think one great thing that's happening with the Descendants Project in Louisiana, because they are working very hard, and you're using sonar, they're using sonar in their neighborhoods, and they're finding where there are grave sites of enslaved people and their enslaved ancestors as a way to keeping any kind of encroachment of any kind of industrial facility.
Wow.
All right, so that is very creative, and some other groups are doing that too. And they're working with, I think, LSU, Louisiana State University. So those are the Banner sisters who are doing that. And they bought a plantation they bought a building that had been a plantation, and that they're going to use for other events, and also communities coming together, building resiliency hubs together. We're doing this in D.C. And so you're building resiliency hubs together so that who's in that community, who's the older people, who are the kids, who need special supports, right? And information, so you would love, maybe you want to have solar panels on your house, but you got to weatherize your house better. You got to do some retrofitting.
Right.
How do you get to those programs, right? What information from the city can you get? So, for example, when we talk about LIHEAP, the Low Income Home Energy Assistance Program, okay, which is a very important program. In D.C., that funding ran out in March, okay?
Yeah.
And you can't apply for it again until October. Now, what's happened between March and October?
Right,
okay?
right.
So that money went out the first quarter, okay? And one of the problems with LIHEAP enjoys bipartisan support. Problem now, LIHEAP was based in Health and Human Services, and all those staff were fired. So there's still money on the table. There's like over $300 million left to be distributed, but there's no staff to do it.
Oh, goodness.
Okay? So these are the types of things. There's going to be a markup, meaning they're going to review the Health and Human Services budget on next week, July 24th. And that's a place where people can advocate and get a hold of their senators and say, restore those personnel in HHS and restore, and we need more money for LIHEAP. All right? And so, because that is a way that communities and folks can get that money. There's also different programs you can look up depending on where you live at your Department of Environment. There's some utilities that have low-income programs. But the federal government has a very popular program that never gets fully funded, and there's money waiting to be distributed. It's called LIHEAP. So that's one way that, and that it's been going on for 50 years. So it's been a real long time. But, in terms of what's culturally appropriate, just tailoring the interventions so that it's not a one-size-fits-all and different cultural contexts. And because heat disproportionately affects certain people, like elderly people differently, right? You know how you have to talk to your elders, okay?
That's right.
Right? And you know how you have to talk to your aunties, okay? And older folks, right?
You got to come correct.
You got to come correct. And you make it plain, which doesn't mean dumbing down.
That's right.
Okay? Just make it plain, all right? And we all got to go to school, we got to go to college, we got to go to grad school and all these sorts of things maybe, because they supported us.
That's
all right? And so, make it plain for our folks, and that way to bring them along, and if appropriate, then, like I said, make sure there was the proper language, the proper cultural aspects of it. I think that sometimes we're not the best messengers. Yeah. Maybe it's the pastor. Okay? Maybe it's, someone in the community group, all right? Or in the church, or someone who they respect in the community, right? Yeah. So that's a lot of, we have to remember, like, we're not the best messengers sometimes. And let the person know. And, when it comes to, like, the tree plantings and it comes to getting information out, that's what I was saying about the Center for Sustainable Communities in Portsmouth, Virginia. They really are the messengers in the community and getting the word out. This is why it's important to plant trees, all right? And it's also an investment in your community. Yeah. Because tree cover is hugely important. It's much cooler in the shade. There's a new book about that out now too. But it's like you look at like different parts of town. Who is cooler where Rhodes College is versus in Memphis over by the University of Memphis doesn't have as much tree cover last time I checked as it does over in Rhodes.
That is correct.
Okay, and so it's cooler over there. Those trees are tended. And they're seen as, it's also part of your heritage, right? And so your natural heritage. And we need to promote the natural heritage for children and also approaching children to make sure they get the right environmental education that we got with our grandparents, right? Yeah. And so we have that appreciation. If you don't have the appreciation, you're not going to care about it as much. Right. And so I think that's also super important. Even if they might not get it in school, take them out, just take them out for a little hike or a little walk and take them, point out the different plants and point out these things and have them or plant something, a little tomatoes or something like that. These are all things that spark their interest, okay, and also gets them off the phones.
Right.
All right, and we all know that children need to be in nature, and it's better for them, all right, and also because you see babies swiping now, that scares me.
It scares me.
Yeah. It's changed our brains.
That's not what, and my granny would say, that's not what the Lord wants for us.
Right, so traditional building techniques, the indigenous communities do this all the time. The traditional building techniques around the sacred spaces for them, sacred places, and storytelling is super important. That's one of the great things we're doing now at WEAC. We've got these great story maps.
Yeah.
And they're really fun. And so telling stories, that's since the dawn of time and human nature. That's how we respond to doing things in terms of a story atmosphere, and we do our story maps, and they resonate with a lot of people. And I think that also just what's culturally sensitive, community gardens. I remember in New York City, there were all there was a whole movement there's a whole movement for community gardens, and then Giuliani tried to take them out, right?
Oh.
Okay, and people really fought for their community gardens.
As they should.
Right? And land that wasn't being used and turning that over, and so that you feel, one of the, there's also programs where people who've immigrated from other countries can identify the migratory birds, that have come up, okay? And you can identify your abuela lived, in Guatemala, and there's the migratory, the butterflies and the birds, and you can relate to that sort of thing, right, in nature. So that is, and you want to preserve that. So those are the kinds of things that culturally appropriate, have the language access, and it's part of what you grew up with or about, you want to get back to.
So first of all, that got me hyped. There's so many, so it doesn't have to be, so even though like clearly this issue is like super important, it's a priority, but it doesn't have to be so pomp and circumstance. Our approaches don't have to, and they shouldn't be colonial type of approaches. Right. Like I think about all the integration of technology and all of these various things where you're commodifying this issue. It could very well be something where we're leaning into indigenous knowledge and practices to address this. Because at the end of the day, Mama Earth is going to survive. Now, for us, we don't know. Right. So I really appreciate you lifting that up. That cultural relevancy component is really important. And then also, I love the part where you said, like, everybody is not meant for everybody, so it's really important that we think about diversity in a way in which, like, who's relaying the information and how they're relaying the information. You know, I'm from Memphis. We have a church on every corner, you know, so it is important to bring in the faith-based community. It is important to think about how do you engage, like, with your elders, because you need to make it plain, like you said. I'm thinking about, you know, elders in my family and my aunties, where it gets to the point. Make it, you know, make it real concise. So we are getting close to the end.
Oh, no.
I know, right? I know. This is so good.
Yeah.
I'll do one more question before we wrap up.
All right.
So one big topic of conversation right now is the energy grid. Ooh, my Lord.
Yes.
So a few years ago, you know, we recall what happened in Texas, where even though this wasn't necessarily a heat-induced issue, but it really exposed just how fragile our energy grids are across the country. But when we think about extreme heat, that also puts a significant strain on our energy grid. So I think about, for example, this was some years back, but even though I'm still 25. But once upon a time, I used to have a postdoctoral fellowship here in D.C., and there was this insane, like, rainstorm. It was really hot, and then it just was this crazy storm.
The derecho.
Yeah, it was insane. But then the power went out, and I remember I used to stay with a bunch of Howard kids, even though I didn't go to Howard. But we were in like a 14-floor building, so with no elevator, like no air conditioning. So when we think about these extreme heat events, it does have a connection to the sustainability and reliability of our energy grids. So thinking about that, we have to get creative around ownership and more local control, like, of our energy sources. So how can we promote, like, energy democracy and really ensuring that particularly communities that have been historically, you know, divested, how can we ensure that there's access to more reliable and affordable energy, and that includes, like, cooling, HVAC, you know, the whole spectrum? What are some ways that we can really focus on that from a community level?
Well, that is, people written dissertations on this.
I know,
this
right?
is a huge issue. Okay, there's a lot of great work being done on this, and have been done on this. And so, you know, when we talk about energy democracy, we're talking about community control, access, clean energy transition, just transition, but ownership, you know, of systems, right? And so the promotion of clean energy and the education and awareness of where your energy comes from.
That part.
Okay.
Yes.
And learning about that. I mean, it's been education for me. And so, you know, who is your utility, right? And depending on where you live, you know, you might have a monopoly, like DTE in Detroit, okay? And so, or you might have opportunities to be involved in creating your own energy, selling it back, you know, with a credit, get some credits and that sort of thing. If you look on your, you know, get online and you first, I think, just to educate yourself about where your energy comes from. All right, your Department of Energy or Environment of your town. We have the DOEE in here in the District of Columbia, and they've got a bunch of programs. Okay, and you can say signed up for. I want my electricity to come from this clean energy source. Signed up for that, and you know, I get a bill from another third party, and it's a little cheaper. Right, I'm thinking about, because I own my home, got a new roof because I had to get a new roof. Oof. Yes, so that had to happen first. I couldn't put solar panels on my old funky roof. Okay, so that required, you know, a lot of expenditure. Okay, and so you have to figure out where you are in that spectrum of things. But I think it's really important to educate yourself. I think it's also important to hold energy providers accountable.
Yes.
So learning about where your Public Utility Commission, or Public Service Commission, who that is, what do they do, and what organizations may be involved in that. So it might be, you know, a local environmental justice group, might be your local Sierra Club group. I was at the Sierra Club for 16 years. So, you know, different Sierra Club chapters and groups are very active. It just depends where you are. You got the Chickasaw chapter in Tennessee, okay? And they got involved in a lot of different things. And so, when it comes to the transition to clean energy, looking into what's been invested in renewable energy sources, energy storage, and grid modernization, educating yourself, but also holding the utilities accountable, also looking into what can you do about community ownership and local decision making. All right. And so it's complicated. And I think if you just start out just finding out what's going on in your own community and then finding out who locally is working on this, okay, you can get involved in that and really make a change on how your energy is delivered and possibly get involved in how you can start owning your means of energy. All right. And so that's what's also very exciting. Now, unfortunately, this administration got rid of a lot of tax credits and incentives lately in that big old terrible bill, right? So a lot of this, depending on where you are, some of these will be going away at the end of this year. All right, and we need to be proactive with our legislators on now the state level and local level to make sure that they promote this as well, because it's important to have options. All right. That's all we're talking about are options. We're not talking about any more monopolies who can just jack up rates, indiscriminately, and you don't have a choice, and you've got to decide between keeping your house cool or warm in the winter, paying extra, and not being able to pay for other things. That's how people stay poor. And you don't have funding to retrofit your house, weatherize your house, just to make it. Just by buying, I just bought triple dipple super duper windows, okay, has made such a difference. All right, so it's not even about putting an extra something else on your house.